Chapter 1: A Diplomatic Contact. The ceaseless, weeping fog of a London November had settled upon Baker Street with an unusual tenacity that evening, clinging to the gas lamps like mournful shrouds and blurring the outlines of the usually familiar thoroughfare. Within the cosy confines of our sitting room at 221B, however, the warmth of a robust fire wrestled valiantly with the encroaching chill, casting dancing shadows upon the well-worn armchair where I, John H. Watson, M.D., sat engrossed in a treatise on tropical diseases. My companion, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, was immersed in one of his customary periods of profound introspection, his long, lean figure silhouetted against the window, observing, no doubt, some transient human drama invisible to my less tutored eye. The faint strains of his violin had, for once, been silenced, replaced by the crackle of the hearth and the distant hoot of a cab. It was precisely this quietude, this lull in the usual hurly-burly of our existence, that often served as a prelude to some extraordinary disturbance. And so it proved on this occasion. The resounding knock that presently shattered the stillness was not the familiar, brisk rap of a Scotland Yard inspector, nor the timid tap of some distressed citizen. It was a firm, almost imperious summons, followed swiftly by the ascent of heavy, measured footsteps upon our stair. Mrs. Hudson, with a degree of trepidation evident in her usually unflappable demeanour, ushered in a figure whose appearance was as unexpected as the hour of his arrival. He was a man of distinguished bearing, though somewhat dishevelled by the inclement weather. His dark, impeccably tailored overcoat was still beaded with moisture, and his wide-brimmed hat, clutched tightly in his hand, seemed incapable of wholly containing his aura of agitated solemnity. His face, though framed by a neatly trimmed dark beard, was pale, his eyes dark and urgent. "Mr. Holmes?" "Dr. Watson," he began, his English precise, though tinged with a distinct, melodious accent. "My name is Don Felipe. I come to you from Madrid, on behalf of a matter of the most delicate and pressing nature, one which concerns, I assure you, the very stability of the Spanish crown." Holmes turned slowly from the window, his keen grey eyes instantly assessing the newcomer. "Indeed, Don Felipe," he replied, his voice a low, resonant murmur. "The hour is late for such an introduction. Pray, be seated by the fire, and unburden yourself of this weighty matter. Watson, the decanter, if you please." Don Felipe accepted a glass of brandy with a curt nod of thanks, his gaze darting between us, as if to gauge our discretion. "Gentlemen," he began, lowering his voice almost to a whisper, "for some months now, information of the most confidential character has been systematically leaking from the royal palaces in Madrid. Sensitive state secrets, private family matters, all are finding their way into unscrupulous hands. We suspect treachery from within, perhaps several individuals, but their identities, their number, and the full scope of their conspiracy remain utterly unknown to us." He paused, his hands tightening on the arms of his chair. "The Crown requires absolute discretion. Any public whisper of this internal betrayal could ignite a scandal of catastrophic proportions, both domestically and internationally. It is for this reason that we have turned to you, Mr. Holmes, famed for your unique methods and, I might add, your unparalleled discretion." Holmes, who had initially listened with an air of detached curiosity, now leaned forward slightly, a faint flicker of interest kindling in his eyes. So, you ask me to find ghosts in your palatial labyrinth, Don Felipe? To identify shadows amongst 1,000 servants, all without disturbing the surface calm? A challenging proposition, certainly, given the complete absence of any concrete evidence you present. Precisely, Mr. Holmes, the diplomat affirmed, his desperation palpable. We fear that any overt investigation, any hint of suspicion, would send these traitors into deeper hiding, or worse, provoke a desperate act. We need them identified, yes, but more importantly, we need them apprehended simultaneously and discreetly, without warning. A slow smile, a rarity on Holmes's usually austere features, began to spread. The challenge, it seemed, had piqued his formidable intellect. A most intriguing proposition, Don Felipe, he mused, tapping his long fingers together. To unravel a hidden conspiracy within a foreign court, to operate under the very noses of the culprits, and then to orchestrate their apprehension with the precision of a master clockmaker. Yes, the sheer audacity of it appeals. I will undertake your commission, but upon one unshakable condition. Don Felipe leaned forward eagerly. Name it, Mr. Holmes. Anything within our power. Complete and absolute autonomy, Holmes stated, his gaze piercing. My methods are my own. I shall require all necessary access, assistance, and resources, but no interference, no questions regarding my interim steps. You must place your absolute trust in my judgment, even when it appears most unorthodox. And my good friend, Dr. Watson, must accompany me, both as my invaluable chronicler and, I dare say, as a useful foil in the intricate game we are about to play. Don Felipe hesitated for only a moment, weighing the immense risk against the desperate need. Then, with a deep breath, he nodded. Agreed, Mr. Holmes. The honor of Spain, and indeed the future of her monarchy, rests in your hands. You shall have your autonomy. Preparations for your discreet passage to Madrid will begin at once. As Don Felipe departed into the swirling London fog, leaving behind a lingering scent of exotic tobacco, Holmes returned to the window, his gaze now alight with an inner fire. Watson, he said, without turning, it appears our immediate future involves rather more sunshine than this dismal city provides. The game, my dear fellow, is afoot, and the chessboard, for once, is royal and Castilian. Chapter 2: Arrival in Madrid and Initial Observations. Our departure from London was as inconspicuous as Don Felipe had promised. Under the cloak of a pre-dawn gloom, we boarded a private carriage, whisked through the still slumbering streets, and found ourselves, by various circuitous routes, aboard a swift steamer bound for the continent. Holmes, under the guise of an English academic specializing in Iberian folklore, seemed to relish the anonymity, burying himself in obscure texts on Spanish heraldry and courtly etiquette. I, for my part, was presented as his research assistant, a rather generous embellishment of my true role, though one I bore with good humor. The journey, swift and uneventful, was punctuated by Holmes's occasional pronouncements on the history of Spanish espionage or the subtle nuances of its aristocracy, each observation more intricate and surprising than the last. Our arrival in Madrid was equally clandestine. We were met by a taciturn, dark-clad driver and conveyed through winding, ancient streets to a less frequented entrance of the Palacio de la Zarzuela, the principal residence of the Spanish royal family. We were not, as I had half expected, ushered into the opulent main chambers, but rather a secluded, somewhat austere wing, typically reserved for visiting scholars or distant, minor nobility. Here we were to maintain our academic cover, our presence deliberately downplayed, a whisper amongst the grand pronouncements of the court. The atmosphere within the palace walls, even in our quiet corner, was immediate and palpable. It was a peculiar blend of suffocating formality and an underlying current of hushed suspicion. Courtiers glided with practiced ease through sun-drenched corridors, their conversations rarely rising above a murmur. Servants moved with an almost balletic precision, their faces impassive. Yet, beneath this polished surface, one could almost feel the weight of unspoken anxieties, the subtle shifts in allegiances, and the constant, silent watchfulness of all against all. Holmes, once settled, wasted no time. Our first few days were spent not in active investigation, but in what he termed osmotic absorption. He would spend hours simply observing. From our window overlooking a quiet inner courtyard, he would watch the comings and goings of the palace staff. He took note of their routines, the precise hour the kitchen staff arrived, the path taken by the daily delivery of fresh produce, the frequency with which the royal secretaries moved between various offices. He possessed an almost supernatural ability to discern patterns where I saw only chaos. "Observe, Watson," he would murmur, his gaze fixed on a distant figure. "The young scullery maid, Maria, always carries her basket on her left arm in the morning, but on her right in the afternoon." A minor point, you might think, but indicative of a subtle change in her duties, perhaps even the weight or type of content she transports. Such details, when accumulated, paint a comprehensive picture. Indeed, his focus was not on the grand, sweeping statements of loyalty or disloyalty, but on the minutiae of daily palace life. He meticulously studied the layout of the palace, not from official maps, but from the subtle wear on particular staircases, the polished sheen of certain door handles, the dusty, untouched corners of neglected passages. He paid keen attention to the types of paper and ink used in different departments, the subtle variations in livery worn by servants, and the precise timing of delivery schedules. "The true nature of an organization, Watson," he once explained, gesturing towards a distant window where a clerk was diligently poring over ledgers, "is not found in its grand pronouncements, but in its logistical arteries. Information, like blood, flows through these channels. Our task is not merely to identify the disease, but to map its circulatory system, to understand how it travels, where it pauses, and which vessels it corrupts." He seemed less concerned, in these initial stages, with who might be the traitor, and more with how the information was being transmitted. The identity of the spy will ultimately reveal itself through the method of their operation, he concluded, often before disappearing for hours on solitary, almost phantom-like explorations of the palace's vast network of back passages and service stairwells. I, meanwhile, was tasked with the less glamorous but equally vital role of memorizing faces, logging appearances, and quietly observing the seemingly trivial social interactions that formed the undercurrents of palace life, a humble recorder in the grand, silent theatre of His Most Catholic Majesty's Court. Chapter 3: The Web of Whispers. As the initial days turned into a week, Holmes's reconnaissance deepened beyond mere logistical observation. He now turned his piercing intellect to the intricate, often opaque, web of human relationships that formed the very fabric of the royal household. The palace, I began to realize, was not merely a collection of opulent chambers and gilded halls. It was a self-contained society, brimming with its own subtle hierarchies, ancient feuds, whispered alliances, and suppressed resentments. Holmes became a veritable ghost within this grand edifice. Dressed in nondescript attire, sometimes affecting the hurried air of an archivist, at others the contemplative mien of a visiting botanist studying the palace gardens, he moved with an uncanny ability to blend into the background. I observed him, from a discreet distance, as he lingered near bustling staff entrances, sat idly in outer waiting rooms, or paused, seemingly lost in thought, beside a particularly ornate tapestry. He was not listening for overt confessions or damning declarations, rather, he was attuned to the subtlest vibrations of human interaction. "Observe the glances, Watson," he instructed one evening, as we sat cloistered in our modest rooms, reviewing my meticulous notes on the day's trivialities. The fleeting eye contact between a scullery maid and a junior aide, the exaggerated deferential bow from a footman to a particular secretary, the almost imperceptible tensing of a shoulder when two individuals cross paths. These are not random acts, my dear fellow. They are the linguistic fragments of an unspoken dialogue, the silent indicators of alliance, animosity, or, crucially for our purpose, a shared secret. He was particularly fascinated by the flow of information itself. We noted the precise routes by which morning dispatches travelled from the Crown's private secretary to various ministers, how personal messages were conveyed between members of the royal family and their retinues, and which individuals enjoyed unfettered access to particular chambers or sensitive documents. Holmes developed a peculiar interest in the disposal of waste paper, often subtly diverting bags of discarded correspondence to our chambers under the pretext of examining the paper quality for his supposed historical research. "The waste bin, Watson," he pronounced, sorting through a pile of innocuous-looking scraps, "is often a more truthful chronicler of events than the archive document. What is intended to be forgotten often reveals the most." His methods became increasingly subtle, bordering on the manipulative. He would, for instance, contrive to leave a seemingly insignificant, yet subtly charged a piece of information, perhaps a partially obscured court schedule or a fabricated detail about a minor royal engagement, in a location frequented by one subset of staff. He would then withdraw, observing not who discovered it, but who reacted to it, how quickly the information seemed to propagate, and in what form it eventually recirculated back to him through the palace rumor mill. These were his delicate tests, his chemical reagents applied to the human element. My own role, while less cerebral, was no less taxing. Holmes tasked me with becoming a walking compendium of the palace's social register. I was to cultivate a peripheral awareness of every significant employee, from the formidable majordomo to the lowliest stable boy. Note their conversational partners, their preferred haunts for luncheon, their habitual complaints, their ambitions, their peccadillos, Holmes had urged. A man's character is often best revealed in the trivialities of his daily life. I found myself frequenting staff canteens, lingering in the palace library, and even engaging in polite, if rather stilted, conversations with various domestics, always under the guise of an English visitor attempting to master the intricacies of Spanish culture. It was exhausting work, a ceaseless act of observation and memorization, yet I could not deny the fascination of piecing together this vast, human tapestry. "We must remember, Watson," Holmes remarked one evening, contemplating a complex diagram he had sketched, illustrating the interconnections between various palace departments, "that treachery rarely wears a single face. It is highly improbable that our antagonists are a homogeneous group. Some may be driven by financial gain, others by political conviction, some by personal grievances, and perhaps even one or two by a perverse sense of amusement. They are likely a diverse assembly, each exploiting a different vulnerability in this vast, ancient institution." He pointed to various nodes on his diagram. "The challenge, my dear fellow, is to find the common thread that binds these disparate individuals, to discern not just who they are, but the unique conduit each represents in the systematic hemorrhage of the crown's secrets. The palace's very vastness, its complexity, and its ingrained routines provide both their greatest protection and, ultimately, their downfall." Chapter 4, The First Thread, The Gardener's Gambit. For several days, Holmes's seemingly aimless wanderings and profound silences persisted, punctuated only by his cryptic pronouncements and my own diligent, if often unenlightening, reports. I confess, a part of me began to wonder if the labyrinthine nature of the palace, combined with the sheer number of its inhabitants, had finally presented a challenge too amorphous even for my friend's extraordinary intellect. Yet, I knew better than to voice such doubts. Holmes's processes, though often opaque, were invariably leading towards a singular, inevitable revelation. And then, it came. It was late afternoon, the sun casting long, dramatic shadows across the formal gardens, when Holmes returned to our rooms, a peculiar light in his eyes. He had spent the morning, as he often did, observing the palace's extensive grounds, ostensibly admiring the meticulous landscaping. "Watson," he began, without preamble, removing a speck of dirt from his sleeve with fastidious care, "I believe we have found our first loose thread in this tapestry of deceit. Or, to be more precise, our first erratic bloom in a field of ordered horticulture." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "There is a gardener, an older fellow named Matteo, responsible for the rose garden bordering the west service entrance. For 3 consecutive mornings, at precisely 9:15, and again at 2:15 in the afternoon, Matteo performs an unusual detour. His designated route takes him directly past this service entrance, yet he invariably veers off for a moment, ostensibly to prune a rosebush some 10 yards from his actual work area. The pruning, I assure you, is either unnecessary or performed with a singular lack of horticultural expertise." I frowned, struggling to see the significance. "Perhaps he is simply particular about his roses, Holmes." Holmes's thin lips curled into a faint smile. "A fair deduction, Watson, were it not for the fact that the rosebush in question is a particularly hardy variety, requiring minimal attention, and Matteo's pruning consists more of a cursory prod than actual husbandry. More tellingly, his glance, though fleeting, consistently focuses on a specific section of the wall near the entrance, a section composed of aged, somewhat uneven stonework, far from any botanical interest." A dead letter drop, then. I ventured, a flash of understanding illuminating my thoughts. Precisely my conjecture, Holmes affirmed, retrieving his magnifying glass. A simple, almost archaic method, designed to appear as an innocuous part of the palace's daily rhythm. The very regularity of his action suggests he is either leaving or retrieving something. But to merely observe is insufficient, we require confirmation. The next morning, Holmes put his theory to the test. He dispatched me with a seemingly innocent, indeed rather tedious, task of cataloguing the various species of flora in a remote section of the garden. He then, with a subtle movement, accidentally knocked over a bucket of water near the aforementioned service entrance, just as Matteo was approaching for his morning pruning. The old gardener, startled by the sudden splash, cursed under his breath in Spanish and was momentarily distracted from his routine. He hurried to grab a cloth from a nearby shed, momentarily leaving his usual spot. In that brief window, Holmes, with a dexterity that belied his casual demeanor, knelt by the wall. His fingers, swift and practiced, probed the uneven stonework. When Matteo returned, grumbling about clumsiness, Holmes was already standing, calmly adjusting his hat, his face an unreadable mask. Matteo, after a perfunctory glance at the now slightly damp wall, resumed his pruning and soon moved on. Holmes waited until the gardener was out of sight before turning to me, a glint of triumph in his eyes. "Bingo, Watson! As suspected. The fourth stone from the bottom, to the left of the archway, is loose. A cavity, barely large enough for a folded piece of paper." From his palm, he produced a small, tightly folded square of parchment, stained with dust and smelling faintly of damp earth. I took it, my heart quickening. "What does it say?" Holmes took it back, his eyes scanning the crude scrawl within. Not a confession, alas, nor a blueprint for overthrowing the monarchy. It's a series of seemingly random numbers and letters, intermingled with a few Spanish colloquialisms, 17, art sol, followed by 3 café and 2000p. Cryptic, but undoubtedly a form of clandestine communication. Not a leak of specific information, perhaps, but a set of instructions, or a coded rendezvous. Our Matteo is a courier, not necessarily a source himself, but a vital link in the chain. He refolded the parchment with care. The significance, Watson, is not merely in the message, but in the confirmation. We now know that our network of spies is not purely conceptual, it has flesh and blood. And we have successfully identified our first participant, without so much as a whisper of suspicion falling upon him. The game, it seems, has indeed begun. Chapter 5: Unmasking the Minor Player, the Laundry List. The small, dust-stained parchment bearing Matteo's cryptic message became a focal point of Holmes's intense scrutiny that evening. He spent hours poring over the numbers and letters, consulting railway timetables, mapping out sections of Madrid, and even examining samples of palace menu schedules. "It's a meeting point, Watson," he finally declared, pushing the parchment across the table. "The 17 or Art Sol suggests a specific location near the Puerta del Sol, perhaps a café at 3 Café, a common local reference. And 2000p is undoubtedly a sum of pesetas. Matteo is not delivering information, he is delivering to a rendezvous, likely receiving payment or further instructions. His next move was characteristic of his ingenious methods. Instead of intercepting Matteo, which might have tipped off the entire network, Holmes crafted a subtle deception. He painstakingly copied the gardener's handwriting and style, then created a new message. This modified parchment retained the original cryptic structure but altered the details, a slightly different time, a subtly shifted location, and a sum of money that, while plausible, would be just unusual enough to cause a mild ripple in the conspirators' plans, without immediate alarm. This harmless, yet altered, missive was then carefully folded and returned to the loose stone in the palace wall. "If our man is merely a simple courier," Holmes explained, "he will pass on this slightly altered instruction without question. If he is something more, he might notice the change. Either way, his next action will tell us much." The following morning, we positioned ourselves discreetly. I, armed with a pair of opera glasses, observed from a window overlooking the West Service entrance, while Holmes, disguised as a groundskeeper, trimmed a distant hedge, his eyes, I knew, missing nothing. As predicted, Matteo arrived at his customary time. He paused, gave a quick, furtive glance around, and swiftly retrieved the parchment from its hiding place. His movements were swift, practiced, and betrayed not a hint of suspicion regarding the subtle alteration. The crucial observation came a short while later. Matteo, having completed his perfunctory gardening duties, moved towards the palace's vast laundry section, ostensibly to drop off some soiled gardening smocks. There, amidst the billowing steam and the rhythmic thud of washboards, he encountered a stout, middle-aged woman named Innes, one of the senior laundry attendants. Their interaction appeared entirely innocuous, a brief exchange of words, a shared jest about the weather, and then, as Innes reached for a pile of freshly folded linens, Matteo, with a movement so practiced it was almost imperceptible, slipped the folded parchment into her basket. Innes, without a break in her conversation or a flicker of recognition, turned and disappeared into the depths of the laundry rooms. "There, Watson!" Holmes exclaimed, a note of triumph in his voice, as he rejoined me. The next link in the chain. Innes, the laundry attendant. A perfect intermediary, with access to outgoing palace articles and, no doubt, a reputation for being above suspicion. Holmes's deduction was swift and incisive. Innes, with her daily access to the palace laundry sent out for cleaning and delivery, is undoubtedly the next courier. She likely possesses the means to pass this information out of the palace without arousing suspicion, perhaps to an external contact, or even another internal conspirator with even greater reach. My task, the next day, was clear, if somewhat odious. Holmes instructed me to follow the palace laundry wagons. "Observe their routes, Watson," he directed. "Pay particular attention to any unscheduled stops, any unusual packages, or any interaction that deviates from the expected. The linens themselves, my dear fellow, may tell us a story." And indeed, they did. After 2 days of following the lumbering laundry carts through the bustling streets of Madrid, my persistence was rewarded. One particular wagon, destined for a large commercial laundry facility on the outskirts of the city, made an unscheduled stop at a small, unassuming bakery in a quiet side street. The driver, ostensibly delivering some freshly baked bread, engaged in a rather prolonged conversation with the baker's assistant. More importantly, as he handed over a basket of freshly laundered kitchen towels, I distinctly observed a peculiar, almost deliberate, placement of a single, slightly larger, white linen napkin on top of the pile. Upon later investigation, once the wagon had departed, I noticed a subtle, almost invisible, ink mark on the corner of the napkin, a small, stylized M, a mark that, through Holmes's previous observations of the laundry process, I recognized as indicating linens belonging to the personal chambers of a minor royal functionary. I relayed my findings to Holmes that evening. His eyes gleamed. "Excellent, Watson!" A dead drop of a different sort, utilizing the mundane flow of commerce. The lem indicates a specific source or perhaps a recipient within the royal household whose linens are being used for this covert communication. This confirms Innes's role as the intermediate courier, passing the information to an external recipient via the bakery. The network, my dear Watson, is far more elaborate than a few isolated individuals. It is a system, carefully designed and meticulously executed. And we, my dear fellow, are now tracing its very arteries. Chapter 6: The Labyrinth Deepens, the Scullery and the Secretary. The discovery of the baker's shop as an external conduit for the leaked information provided Holmes with a crucial external landmark in the otherwise insular world of the palace. For the next few days, our attention was divided. While I continued my vigilant, if tedious, observations of internal palace movements, Holmes spent considerable time positioned strategically near the bakery, often disguised as a grizzled local, engrossed in a Spanish newspaper or nursing a small cup of coffee. He swiftly confirmed that the baker's assistant, a young man named Pedro, was indeed the one handling the marked linens. Pedro would discreetly extract the coded napkin from the laundry basket, carry it into the back of the shop, and return moments later, sometimes with a fresh, unmarked napkin in its place, sometimes empty-handed. This suggested he was either decoding the messages himself or, more likely, passing them on to a third party. "The external end of the chain is now clear, Watson," Holmes announced upon his return one evening, his eyes alight with fresh deductions. "The bakery serves as the crucial transfer point, the nexus between the palace's internal channels and the ultimate recipient of the stolen information. But our task remains to identify the remaining internal sources, those who provide the raw material for these illicit dispatches." Holmes then turned his focus back to the palace, specifically to the interaction surrounding Innes, the laundry attendant. "Innes is a conduit, Watson, not a source of valuable intelligence herself. She handles the transmission. Therefore, she must receive her information from someone with greater access than a gardener or a linen folder. She is connected to Matteo, but who is her primary internal source?" His observations, coupled with my own detailed notes on staff movements and relationships, soon pointed to a new individual, Diego, a burly, seemingly jovial scullery worker. Diego spent his days in the hot, clamorous environment of the palace kitchens, a veritable nerve center of daily life, gossip, and the ceaseless flow of supplies and personnel. "Note, Watson," Holmes elucidated, tracing a line on his rudimentary palace map, "Diego's proximity to the kitchen offices, where daily menus, guest lists, and even sensitive catering details are discussed. He also has legitimate access to service corridors that connect directly to more private wings of the palace, areas where even inns would rarely venture. More importantly, I have observed a peculiar regularity in his interactions with inns. Holmes had noted that inns, during her rounds collecting soiled kitchen linen, would often spend a few minutes longer in the scullery area than strictly necessary. During these brief intervals, Diego would invariably be nearby, seemingly engrossed in his work. Their conversations were always brief, seemingly innocuous exchanges about kitchen supplies or laundry schedules, but Holmes detected a subtle, almost imperceptible transfer of something small, a folded note, a scrap of paper, occurring during these exchanges. The movements were so fluid, so well rehearsed, that they could easily be mistaken for an accidental brush or the passing of a utensil. Diego, then, I concluded, is providing inns with the information, which she then funnels through the bakery. Precisely, Holmes confirmed. He is closer to the heart of the palace's secrets than Matteo, less directly involved in external movements than inns. He likely gathers snippets of information from the endless chatter of the kitchen staff, from discarded notes, or by simply being in the right place at the right time in his service routes. A common method, Watson, but effective when consistent. But it was in the transfer that Holmes found his proof. He observed that Sophia would often hand Ramirez a rolled-up scroll of what appeared to be an architectural plan or a reproduction of a historical document. Ramirez, in turn, would accept it with a deferential bow. However, upon closer inspection through his powerful field glasses, Holmes noted that Ramirez would always casually, almost automatically, run his thumb along the edge of the scroll, as if smoothing it. And in that fleeting motion, a tiny, folded piece of parchment would vanish from Sophia's hand into a hidden cuff or a small pocket in Ramirez's velvet waistcoat. The architectural plans were merely a prop, the parchments the true object of exchange. Ramirez, Watson, Holmes declared, back in our rooms, sketching furiously in his notebook. A man of culture, impoverished perhaps, and clearly engaged in the more intellectual side of this espionage. He is not merely a courier. He is translating these raw snippets of information, Sophia's private notes on royal health, political movements, personal correspondence, into coded messages, likely far more sophisticated than Matteo's numerical scrawl. His access to the archives, where he can plausibly spend hours undisturbed, provides the perfect cover for such clandestine work. The deeper digging into Ramirez's background revealed his financial woes and, more importantly, his social circles. Holmes, leveraging his academic persona, found a way to subtly engage Ramirez in conversation about his work. It was during these seemingly innocuous discussions that Holmes identified the curator's primary and highest level contact, Count Esteban, a prominent figure in the Spanish aristocracy, a man with a lineage as old as the palace itself, and a reputation for unwavering loyalty to the crown. Count Esteban was, on the surface, above all suspicion. He held no official government post, yet his personal friendship with senior members of the royal family, his frequent appearances at court functions, and his privileged access to private audiences made him an invaluable asset to any intelligence network. He was the one who could move in the highest circles, gather the most sensitive gossip, and transmit the most damaging secrets without raising a single eyebrow. Holmes recounted an observation of Count Esteban and Ramirez meeting in a secluded alcove during a small private concert. Ramirez, after a seemingly intense discussion about a rare Renaissance manuscript, discreetly passed a small, leather-bound book to the Count. The book, Watson, was far too recent for the subject of their conversation, and the Count received it with a possessive gesture that spoke volumes. This was no innocent exchange of cultural appreciation. This was the transfer of highly classified information, likely ready for direct transmission to the ultimate buyer, a foreign power or a rival political faction. The realization was stark. The network extended from the simple gardener to a respected nobleman. We now had a clearer picture of the hierarchy, Mateo and Inns as the initial, low-level couriers, Diego gathering basic intelligence from the staff, Sophia providing high-value information from the royal family's inner circle, Ramirez encoding and preparing the messages, and Count Esteban, the seemingly unassailable pillar of the aristocracy, serving as the primary conduit for selling the information, leveraging his impeccable reputation and access. Add to this the baker and his assistant, who handled the external transfer, and the Count reached 7 confirmed conspirators. 7. Watson, Holmes concluded, sketching a final node on his intricate diagram. 7 distinct individuals, each playing a critical role in the systematic betrayal of the Spanish crown. And yet, he added, a glint in his eye, my instincts tell me there is one more, a final shadow perhaps, connecting Count Esteban to the initial point of sale. A direct recipient waiting at the end of the line. But our immediate challenge now is not merely to identify this final piece, but to construct a trap so encompassing, so precise, that all 7, and indeed, our phantom 8th, can be snared simultaneously, without warning, without escape, and without a ripple of public scandal. The net, Holmes mused, was almost complete. Now, it was time to prepare the Grand Deception. Chapter 8: The Grand Deception, the Royal Ball and the False Treasure. With 8 spies now meticulously identified, Mateo, the gardener, Inns, the laundry attendant, Diego, the scullery worker, Sophia, the Crown Princess's secretary, Senor Ramirez, the art curator, Count Esteban, the nobleman, and the external contacts, the baker and his assistant, Holmes's analytical phase gave way to one of audacious planning. The challenge, as he had articulated to Don Felipe, was not merely to identify them, but to apprehend them all at precisely the same moment, ensuring no single conspirator could alert another or destroy evidence. Any conventional arrest would undoubtedly trigger panic and allow some to escape. We must turn their very greed and their belief in their own cleverness against them, Watson, Holmes declared one crisp Madrid morning. They operate in shadows, expecting to be untouchable. We shall lure them into the light, each with a carefully tailored, irresistible bait, leading them to their own separate, inescapable traps. Holmes had learned, through his discreet inquiries and the intercepted fragments of information, that a grand royal ball was imminent, a dazzling affair scheduled to celebrate the Crown Princess's birthday. This event, with its inherent chaos, its throngs of guests and servants, and its numerous secluded corners, presented the perfect canvas for his masterpiece of deception. His plan began with a carefully orchestrated rumor that a discovery of a long-lost, fabled piece of royal jewelry, the legendary Emerald of Castile, said to possess immense value and to have been hidden within the palace walls centuries ago during a time of war. News of this discovery was not to be published, but rather leaked through specific, compromised channels. Holmes personally ensured that snippets of this fabricated tale, complete with tantalizing hints about its immense worth and possible location, reached Matteo, Inns, and Diego through their respective rumor mills. For Sofia and Ramirez, more sophisticated hints were dropped, suggesting that newly found historical documents hinted at the emerald's precise whereabouts. For Count Esteban, the bait was even more refined. Holmes, through Don Felipe, had a false report crafted detailing a sudden, urgent interest from a foreign collector in acquiring unique Castilian artifacts of unparalleled historical value, offering an exorbitant, almost unbelievable sum. The report subtly suggested that the Emerald of Castile, if indeed found, would fit this description perfectly and would fetch a king's ransom. The heart of Holmes's plan lay in a series of meticulously crafted false instructions. Each spy, believing they were on the cusp of making their fortune or securing a vital piece of information regarding the emerald's sale, was given a unique, secret task. These tasks were designed to require their presence at a specific, isolated location at the very same time during the royal ball. Matteo, the gardener, received a coded message, ostensibly from Count Esteban via Inns, instructing him to retrieve a hidden map detailing the emerald's exact garden burial site. This map led him to a remote, seldom used grotto at the far end of the palace grounds, far from the festivities. Inns, the laundry attendant, was directed to a rarely used linen room in the palace's oldest wing, where a special package related to the emerald's immediate disposal was supposedly awaiting her, promising a substantial cut. Diego, the scullery worker, received instructions to proceed to a disused pantry in the basement, where he would find a large sum of money and further instructions for a final, crucial delivery related to the emerald's clandestine sale. Sofia, the secretary, believed she was tasked with retrieving a coded ledger from a secluded study, detailing the buyers and transaction details for the emerald, a ledger she would then pass to Ramirez. Senor Ramirez, the curator, was lured to a vault in the archives, a place he frequented, believing he was to verify the authenticity of a document crucial to the emerald's provenience, a verification needed before the Count's final negotiation. Count Esteban, the nobleman, was summoned to a private antechamber, adjacent to the grand ballroom but easily sealed, where he expected to meet his foreign contact for the final payment for the Emerald of Castile, believing it to be already secured. The baker and his assistant received a frantic, anonymous message requesting their presence at a cellar entrance on the palace's service side, promising a massive, covert order of specialty pastries for an after-ball banquet, and an additional, lucrative transportation fee for a mysterious parcel. This was their lure, their promise of great profit. Each instruction was designed to be irresistible, playing on the individual's motivation, be it greed, ambition, or the desire for ultimate control over the valuable information. Holmes had spent days with Don Felipe, meticulously choreographing the movements of trusted palace guards. These loyal men, carefully selected and briefed only on their immediate tasks, were strategically positioned near each designated apprehension point. They were unaware of the full scope of the plot, knowing only that they were to secure specific individuals at a specific time. The stage was set. The royal ball, a glittering tapestry of Spanish high society, was about to become the backdrop for a clinical operation, conceived and executed with the genius of a man who saw not chaos, but a meticulously wound clock, each cog and spring ready to snap into place. The net was cast, wide and invisible. It only awaited Holmes's signal to draw tight. Chapter 9. The net closes, a night of calculated chaos. The night of the royal ball descended upon the Palacio de las Zarzuelas like a shimmering, silken veil. From our vantage point on a secluded balcony, overlooking the grand ballroom, the scene was one of breathtaking splendor. The vast hall, bedecked with thousands of candles and crystal chandeliers, pulsed with light. Ladies in gowns of silk and velvet, their jewels flashing, danced with gentlemen in elaborate uniforms, their medals glinting. The air was thick with the scent of orange blossoms, expensive perfume, and the lilting strains of a Spanish orchestra. It was a spectacle designed to dazzle, to charm, and, crucially, to distract. Holmes stood beside me, his lean figure barely discernible amongst the ornate columns, his eye sweeping the scene with a cold, almost surgical intensity. He had placed me strategically, giving me a small, carefully concealed earpiece through which he would relay his observations, and instructing me to watch for certain individuals, to note their departures from the ballroom. Don Felipe, meanwhile, moved with quiet purpose, a man of gravitas circulating among the guests, his hand occasionally touching an ear, receiving silent confirmations from his deployed men. As the evening progressed, the meticulously laid trap began to spring. "Mateo," Holmes's voice whispered in my ear, "has just slipped away from the servants' entrance to the west garden. Observe his course, Watson, he should be heading for the grotto." I saw the gardener, a fleeting shadow amongst the manicured bushes, hurrying with an uncharacteristic urgency towards the designated rendezvous. He vanished into the deeper foliage. Minutes later, a signal from Don Felipe confirmed Mateo's apprehension. "First catch, Holmes," came the crisp reply, almost instantly. Then, a flurry of movement near the service corridors. "Inns is making her move," Holmes murmured. "Her special package awaits in the linen room." The stout laundry attendant, her face flushed from the kitchen's heat, excused herself from a colleague, a look of focused determination on her usually placid features. I saw her disappear into the shadowed archway leading to the old wing. A moment later, Don Felipe's signal acknowledged the second capture. Diego, the jovial scullery worker, was harder to spot amidst the bustling kitchen staff and those preparing late-night refreshments. But Holmes's trained eye detected him. Diego, ever hungry for his pesetas, is now making his way to the disused pantry in the basement, he informed me. I imagined the scullery man, his hands perhaps already itching to feel the promised bounty, descending into the palace's deeper, forgotten bowels. Again, the swift, silent confirmation from Don Felipe. The dance of deception escalated. Sophia, the quiet secretary, was next. She smoothly disengaged from a small conversation, her expression one of polite apology, and headed towards a lesser-used corridor that led to a secluded study. She believed she was accessing a ledger of priceless information. In reality, she was walking into a calculated snare. "Sophia is secured," came the terse update. Ramirez, the curator moved with an air of detached academic purpose, making his way towards the archives. He carried a small, leather-bound volume, ostensibly for an urgent cross-reference. He was confident in his intellect, his ability to discern the historical truth of the emerald's provenance. Instead, he found only the truth of his own betrayal. Don Felipe's signal was almost immediate. The most delicate apprehension was that of Count Esteban. He was a man of immense influence and cunning. Holmes had observed him for hours, a picture of aristocratic nonchalance, circulating amongst the highest echelons. Finally, a subtle glance, a nod from an unidentifiable figure, prompted the Count to make his excuses and glide towards the private antechamber. He believed his foreign contact awaited him, the final transaction for the emerald imminent. He walked into the hands of Don Felipe's most trusted guards. The confirmation was delivered with a quiet sigh of relief from Don Felipe. Finally, the external conspirators. The baker and his assistant have arrived at the cellar entrance, Holmes announced, his voice betraying a hint of satisfaction. Lured by promises of a substantial order, they are about to receive a rather different kind of delivery. We could hear, faintly, the distant clatter of a heavy door, quickly muffled. Within seconds, Don Felipe confirmed their simultaneous detention. 8 arrests, executed with the precision of a master surgeon. The grand ballroom continued to swirl with music and laughter, entirely oblivious to the quiet drama unfolding in the palace's hidden corners. Not a single scream, not a shouted alarm, not a broken pane of glass. Holmes, with his characteristic genius, had transformed a night of celebration into a night of perfectly choreographed apprehension. "It is done, Watson," Holmes said, finally turning from the spectacle below, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. "The net has closed. And the integrity of the Spanish crown, for tonight at least, has been silently restored." My heart pounded with a mixture of exhilaration and awe. I had witnessed, first-hand, the culmination of a plan so intricate, so daring, that it would surely rank among Holmes's most remarkable achievements, yet one that, by its very nature, would forever remain unsung. Chapter 10: Resolution and Reflection, Justice in the Shadows. The following morning dawned upon Madrid with a crisp, clear sky, as if to wash away the shadows of the preceding night. Within the venerable walls of the Palacio de la Zarzuela, an air of tranquil normalcy prevailed. The grand ballroom, so recently vibrant with music and laughter, now merely bore the faint scent of spent candles and the meticulous order restored by the mourning staff. To all outward appearances, the royal ball had been a resounding success, a glittering testament to the enduring grace of the Spanish crown. Yet, beneath this placid surface, a quiet revolution had indeed occurred. In the privacy of a small, discreetly located salon, Don Felipe, his face etched with exhaustion but alight with profound relief, stood before Holmes and myself. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he began, his voice thick with emotion, words seem inadequate to express the Crown's gratitude. The 8 individuals, Mateo, Inns, Diego, Sofia, Señor Ramirez, Count Esteban, and the 2 men from the bakery, were apprehended precisely as you described. Not a single alarm was raised, not a whisper of scandal has escaped the palace walls. Their interrogations, conducted with the utmost secrecy, have confirmed the depth of their treachery and the meticulous precision of your deductions." He bowed slightly, a gesture of profound respect. "You have performed a service of immeasurable value to Spain, one that, by its very nature, must remain an untold tale. But rest assured, the Crown will not forget." Holmes merely inclined his head, a faint, satisfied gleam in his eyes. "The satisfaction, Don Felipe, lies in the successful application of method. The beauty of a well-executed plan is its own reward." Later, as we prepared for our equally discreet departure from Madrid, Holmes elucidated his complete reasoning to my eager ears, his voice calm and precise. "You see, Watson, the essence of the problem was the very anonymity of the perpetrators. They were not a single, visible entity, but a network, a parasitic system feeding off the host. My initial observations were not about finding the spy, but about understanding the flow of information within the palace." He paced our modest chamber, gesturing with his pipe. Matteo, the gardener, was the most obvious anomaly. His regular, unnecessary detours were a deviation from a man whose life should be dictated by seasonal pruning and watering schedules. The loose stone was crude, but effective for a low-level courier. From Matteo, we traced to Inns, the laundry attendant. Her access to outgoing palace articles made her the perfect intermediary for passing information beyond the immediate confines of the garden. The coded linens, a clever touch, indicating an external drop-off point at the baker's shop. Diego, the scullery worker, was identified by his subtle exchanges with Inns and his presence in the kitchen, a hub of gossip and a central artery for the daily pulse of the palace. His value was in the mundane details he could glean, guest lists, schedules, even petty grievances that could be turned to leverage. The escalation to Sophia, the Crown Princess's secretary, was critical. Her position granted her access to truly sensitive, high-value personal and political information. Her subtle, ritualistic visits to the archives, devoid of any genuine research, pointed directly to Ramirez. Señor Ramirez, the art curator, represented the intellectual arm of the conspiracy. His financial woes made him susceptible, and his ability to encode and translate raw data into sophisticated messages, under the guise of scholarly research, made him invaluable. He was the filter, processing the raw material into a usable product. And finally, Count Esteban. He was the linchpin, Watson, the man above suspicion who provided the ultimate conduit to the buyers. His privileged access, his perceived loyalty, made him the perfect agent for delivering the finished product of the information stream. He embodied the ultimate betrayal, not of a servant, but of a trusted confidant. The baker and his assistant, Holmes concluded, were merely the external extension of the physical transfer, the final handoff from the internal palace network to the unknown recipient beyond. I reflected on his words, the elegant simplicity of his logic once the pieces were assembled. And their motivations, Holmes? What drove such a disparate group? As I surmised, varied, Watson, Holmes replied, exhaling a plume of smoke. Matteo and Inns, likely simple greed, small sums for simple tasks. Diego, perhaps a mix of resentment for his station and the lure of easy money. Sophia, I suspect, ambition and a sense of being undervalued, coupled with financial inducement. Ramirez, undoubtedly, his crippling debts. But Count Esteban, for him, it was likely political ideology, a belief that the current regime was weak, perhaps even a deep-seated grievance long nursed, combined with the ultimate gratification of power and influence, even if through clandestine means. The case, for all its intricate dangers and the profound stakes involved, would never be recounted in the daily papers. There would be no public triumph, no accolades for the detective of Baker Street. Holmes would not be celebrated for dismantling a conspiracy that threatened the very fabric of the Spanish monarchy. As our carriage rattled through the waking streets of Madrid, heading towards the port, I looked at Holmes, his profile sharp against the rising sun. He was already lost in thought, no doubt sifting through the countless other unsolved mysteries of the world. And I, John H. Watson, his loyal chronicler, knew that this particular case, the case of the Castilian courtiers, though never to see the light of print, was a testament to his unique genius, a quiet, uncelebrated triumph of justice, achieved with complete discretion, deep in the shadows of a foreign court. Chapter 7: The Mastermind's Shadow, the Curator and the Count. The revelation of Sophia's involvement cast a long, disquieting shadow over our investigation. Her position as junior secretary to the Crown Princess meant that the conspiracy had not only breached the outer walls of palace security but had insinuated itself dangerously close to the very heart of the royal family. Holmes immediately dedicated himself to observing Sophia with a renewed intensity, often adopting the guise of a visiting historian poring over archival documents in the palace library, a position that allowed him a discreet vantage point for her movements. His confirmation of her complicity came swiftly. Sophia, a woman of sharp intellect and reserved demeanor, exhibited no overt signs of duplicity. Yet, Holmes noted a subtle, almost imperceptible pattern in her work habits. At irregular intervals, often after particularly sensitive meetings involving the princess, Sophia would make an excuse to visit a specific wing of the palace dedicated to historical archives and art restoration. Her visits were always brief, always ostensibly for research, but Holmes observed that she never returned with any discernible research materials. Instead, she would emerge looking subtly different, a slight tension in her shoulders, a fleeting, almost imperceptible gesture of relief. It was during one of these research excursions that Holmes identified her contact. Within the quiet, dust-motes dancing air of the archives, Sophia would invariably seek out Señor Ramirez, a highly respected, albeit somewhat melancholic, art curator. Ramirez, a man of refined tastes but, as Holmes later discovered through discreet inquiries, burdened by significant personal debts, would be ostensibly engaged in cataloguing ancient tapestries or verifying the provenance of a Baroque painting. Their interactions were minimal, a polite nod, a murmured word or two about some forgotten artist.